So we're going to start in a couple of minutes, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions through the chat. And of course, I'll tell you how things will go. We're going to have a quick introduction from me and from Kat, and then we'll introduce our MC for the day and our wonderful speakers. And then they'll all speak first, and then there'll be time for questions at the end of everyone's conversations. And again, we're thrilled you're here. So I'm Robert Garelick. I'm the Senior Director of Philanthropy at the University of Colorado, and thrilled to be working with our team from Arts and Humanities to team up with the Center for Humanities and the Arts. Kath, I think we can get started so that we know that we only have a hard stop for an hour. So we just want to thank you. We want to thank the panelists and the moderator. And again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will collate those. And obviously, if people have similar questions, we'll try and make sure that we encapsulate that in one question or another. I also wanted to mention that at this time, we're going to give a brief statement of care to the audience, and also that this event is being recorded. So I just wanted to let you know that. And from a care perspective or self-care perspective, there are some difficult topics today. We're going to obviously talk about things going on in the world, COVID-19, the 2016 election, the January 6th insurrection, perhaps. And there will be in a moment a brief mention of the March 22nd horrible shooting in King Soopers. And Kat will be talking about that in relation to the winners of the competition through art related to the shooting. So I'm sorry if people are concerned. We completely understand, and we just want to make sure that people take care of themselves. Kat, if you don't mind.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I briefly wanted to talk about our last Humanities at Home event, which took place on May 11th. And it was kind of a difficult topic. It was in relation to the shooting at the Table Mesa King Soopers. We had a panel of artists and campus leaders come together to talk about the ways in which arts and humanities can be tools and connectors through traumatic events. In conjunction with that event, we opened up a call for works for the CU Boulder community to submit art and writing in response to the shooting. We received a lot of excellent submissions, and first place went to an undergraduate student named Jen Douglas, who wrote a very moving piece called Dear March 22nd, where she documents what it was like being a firsthand witness of the shooting. She was waiting outside of the grocery store for her Uber when the shooting took place on that day. Second place went to Jessica Lawson and Ross Taylor. These are two separate projects. Jessica submitted a piece titled Shot that was originally published by Entropy magazine. Ross Taylor submitted a collection of photographs of King Soopers surrounded by the Boulder Strong fencing and memorial, as well as photos from the funeral procession for Officer Talley. Honorable mentions included work submitted by Michael Barnett, Sarah Fahmy, J.P. Mayer, Anjali Mirza, and Alexandra Schultz. Each work can be found on the CHA's website, which I will drop in the chat if anybody would like to take a look at these. They're very, very, very good projects, and I highly recommend taking a look and circulating them around campus.
Thank you, Kat. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories, and I'm delighted to introduce John Michael Rivera, who's the Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado Boulder. He also serves as the Dean of Arts and Humanities. His first book, The Emergence of Mexican America, won the Thomas J. Lyon Best Book Award, and his second book, Undocuments, is through the University of Arizona Press, recently won the Caden Award and the Carol Woodward Pope Endowment. He has edited, introduced, and translated two books for the Recovering of the U.S. Hispanic Library Heritage Project, and has published widely in criticism, memoir, creative nonfiction, poetry, and scholarship. He is the curator of El Laboratorio, a literary space for Latinx writers, and Cross Borders, an international collective of writers and artists engaging in borders. He was the co-founder of Shadowbox magazine, a literary journal for creative nonfiction, and he's also served as the editor of ELN, the English language notes. Without further ado, my pleasure to introduce John Michael Rivera.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much for being here today. I have the pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited about introducing our three panelists. And I want to begin in the order that they will be speaking, if I can. Alex Siegel will be our first discussant, and she will She is an assistant professor of political science here at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's a faculty affiliate of NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics and Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab, and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute. She received her PhD in political science from NYU in 2018. Her research uses social media data, network analysis, and experiments, in addition to more traditional data sources, to study mass and elite political behavior in the Arab world and other comparative contexts. She is a former junior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former CASA fellow at the American University in Cairo. She holds a bachelor's in international relations and Arabic from Tufts University. Our second discussant is Greg Gondwe, and Mr. Gondwe researches contemporary media ecosystems and their implications on society. His scholarly works are based on the interrogation of the effects of persuasive media messages across cultural and geographic boundaries. Essentially, he examines how individuals and groups of different backgrounds assimilate and accept information is either true or false. Toby Hopp is an associate professor whose research interests are broadly related to the uses and effects of digital and interactive media, the social and motivational factors that underlie uncivil online communication, and organizational transparency. Hopp joins us here at CU from the University of Alabama, where he served as an assistant professor. Prior to academia, Hopp worked as a technical writer and a project manager in the healthcare industry. I'd like to welcome our three discussants and thank them so much for being here today and taking time to discuss with us their research and insights on conspiracy theories.
Great, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. As John Michael just mentioned, most of my research focuses on the Arab world, and I think this kind of gives me an important perspective into this topic of conspiracy theories, because this is a region where concern about conspiracy theories has existed for a very long time, long before the advent of social media and long before we were discussing these issues regularly in US domestic politics. And in particular, a large body of research that has spanned several decades suggests that a lack of trust in state media in authoritarian contexts breeds more credence for conspiracy theories and rumor, which are often generated because of the information vacuum that exists in contexts where there aren't trusted media sources or kind of arbiters of truth in a society. And this is by no way limited to the Middle East. This is a longstanding issue, particularly in hybrid and authoritarian regimes. And even, we see evidence of this in George Orwell's 1984, right, where he talks about what happens when a society gets to sort of a post-truth place, which makes it so challenging for people to determine what is fact and what is fiction. And so I think it seems unsurprising then, as trust in traditional media has declined in the US, we've also seen a rise in conspiratorial rhetoric and the amplification of conspiracy theories. And a lot of this has been blamed on the rise of social media, but I think it's quite difficult to kind of establish a causal relationship here between the adoption of social media and belief in conspiracy theories, though it is the case that these platform affordances lead to a situation where conspiratorial rhetoric and misinformation are more visible online than they might have been in the past, and are often amplified by mainstream news. We have kind of a complex media ecosystem that spans both the offline and online spaces. And this happens through a variety of channels, right? So on the one hand, we have kind of organic production of conspiratorial content and its amplification on social media platforms, which later spills over into mainstream coverage and is further amplified. But we've also seen a lot of coordinated, inauthentic activity and the rise of what is often called disinformation for hire, the idea that diverse actors, whether state actors or otherwise, can now hire digital mercenaries to spread misinformation or conspiratorial rhetoric that's designed to help them meet their political or social goals. And so I hope we can start to discuss a number of these issues today, as well as potential solutions to these problems. And when we talk about solutions, I do think it's important to caution that on the one hand, while we can all agree that combating disinformation or conspiratorial rhetoric is a laudable goal, these issues often become sort of talking points that are exploited by bad actors. And so in the region I study, for example, we see regimes labeling their detractors or dissidents as spreading misinformation or conspiracies, right? So they adopt the language used by Western social media platforms to squash dissent at home. So, as we sort of take steps to combat these global issues, it's important to think through unintended consequences. And there's just this broader question that I hope we get to discuss today of who is the arbiter of truth, who gets to decide what is misinformation or conspiracy and what is fact. And leaving that to tech companies alone probably doesn't seem like a very good idea, but hopefully we can all discuss today other potentially better alternatives. So this isn't all doom and gloom, but we also put forth kind of what research tells us about the best paths to solutions to some of these problems we face today. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Siegel. Professor Gondwe.
Hello. Yeah, so for me, I'll start with kind of a story. It's a true story, but I want us to start thinking about questions like who believes in conspiracies? Why? Are they true or false? So on April 2nd, 2020, two French doctors sparked criticism for suggesting that the first COVID vaccine be tested in Africa. The argument was that Africa was a fertile ground because at that time, people were not wearing masks. And then the second thing is that there was no treatment available or intensive care. The third, or the general interpretation was that African people were reckless of their health. So they continued to argue their case, and I quote, like being done for certain AIDS studies where among prostitutes, we try things because we know they are highly exposed and don't protect themselves, said Jean-Paul Mira, the head of the intensive care unit of the Chochin Hospital in Paris. But let's note, by this time, Africa technically had not recorded any COVID cases. So we had no cases in that situation. And yet the vaccine was being suggested to be tested in Africa. And then immediately there was a follow-up mandate where people were asked to quarantine. The environment in Africa is very different from the environment in the United States. Most people here are, let's say, 2 or 3 people in one house. And now we're talking about people that live in a one room, maybe 2 or 3 rooms, and there might be 10 of them in one particular room. So what's the possibility of the quarantine? And so basically what the people thought was the governments or the African leaders were actually just receiving the mandate from the West, and they had no power to say no. Why? Because they were receiving some kind of fund, and it went on by the early April, government started fumigating some common places. They started fumigating common places where people went, and the people did not understand why the government were fumigating those places. And that's where now some conspiracy stories started coming up. Some were saying, the first thing is the West, like they have tried in history, are trying to eliminate the African race. So they want to kill us, and they know that we cannot follow up. And then others were suggesting that they are pushing for 5G. And according to them, 5G was there, I think, to control you, to surveil you. If they have 5G everywhere, then they will know where you are, they can tell you what to do, and there's nothing that you can do. So those were kind of the stories that were happening. And during the same time, I actually conducted a study, a pilot study, where I interviewed about 12 journalists across the Zambia, the whole country, Zambia. And none of them had known anybody that had was infected with COVID. And the general feeling among most journalists was that the governments are either lying that we have COVID cases or are inflating the number of cases so that they can get money from the World Health Organization. So these we get information that sounds credible from both. We're getting information from the West that is being transferred to these government African leaders. And then we have journalists and the community that are questioning this information because it does not align with their system or align with their environment or align with the lifestyles that they live. So I further did a study on gatekeeping, looking at how journalists who work for community media responded to such kind of messages. And by community media, the difference between probably the West and in Africa is that community media are run by community members themselves. And these community members are kind of volunteers. They are not really trained, they're house trained other than professional journalists. So it's conflicting to think of how these people that volunteer for communities are actually receiving messages from the government and spreading it to their own communities. Because at first they are the ones that did not actually believe in government information. They did not believe in information that was coming from Western countries, and they had to actually spread that information to their own communities. But anyway, I won't go back much into the findings, but basically what I found was that such kind of things were emerging as a result of half-baked information. There wasn't enough information either from the West or from the government to convince the people on grassroots that this is what you have to do. And also, as generally people, we do not love, being left in suspense. We always have to find something to fill up those things. So it becomes so complicated in this case to actually think of what is truth or who is actually telling the truth. The story is different today because the cases have inflated in Africa. But generally, with such kind of a situation, I think the questions still remain as who is actually telling the truth. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Professor Gondwe. Professor Hopp.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for coming today, and thanks also for letting me speak. I am an associate professor here at CU in the Advertising, Public Relations, and Media Design Department. I'm also the director of our graduate program here. Over the last couple of years, I've become sort of more interested in issues of political knowledge, mis and disinformation, and institutional behavior in the American context, specifically. Rather than sort of belabor, I think, the things that I specifically study, and I think there's a lot of overlaps between what I look at and what Alex and Greg just discussed. I think I might talk a little bit about some of the things that are interesting to me about this topic of conspiracy theory or mis and disinformation, or however we might like to describe the notion of falsity and contested truth within the social organism. One of the interesting things that I've started to think about is the individual mechanisms versus the institutional mechanisms that allow for problematic or contested information to become part of the contemporary discourse, to enter into this conjectural space that we call the public sphere. What rights and responsibilities do institutions and individuals have when it comes to discussing issues, particularly hard issues, social issues, political issues? I think when we think about quote unquote fake news, we have to obviously recognize that this is not necessarily a new thing. Human beings, I think lying is part of the human condition, and actually lying is quite beneficial to us, right? When your neighbor gets a new haircut that's not very good and they ask you, what do you think about my new haircut? It's quite a nice thing to lie and say that's a nice haircut. So lying has a real social utility. And when we think about fake news itself, quote unquote, and I, of course, would be remiss to not mention that fake news is a very contested term, perhaps not the most accurate way to describe the social phenomena that we're sort of dealing with, but we can think about many instances of quote unquote fake news being used throughout history. So we've got things from the, Octavian, Mark Antony sort of civil war in the Roman period, in which Octavian used coinage to spread sort of salacious rumors about his opponent. We can think about Ben Franklin actually writing a sort of fake news newspaper that was distributed to the British or the French to describe some made up British atrocities in the American or the North America. And things like, go to the grocery store. It's not so much a thing anymore, but the weekly world news, like woman becomes half duck or something like that. And so these things have always been part of society. And that's not to say that they haven't had a negative or something less than a positive effect on society. When we think about the example of the Roman time frame, right? That was actually the sort of Octavian Mark Antony conflict sort of led to the movement away from a democratic style of government and the emergence of the Roman Empire. And so sometimes people like to look at history and say, well, humans survived, they got through it then. I don't necessarily present the historical context as a way of saying that mis and disinformation isn't a problem in society. I don't think it's the biggest problem in society, and I think it's oftentimes a scapegoat for bigger, more substantive issues within a sort of social setting or organism, but rather that it's not necessarily something new. What is new, as Alex mentioned, is the sort of collectivization of or the efficiencies that can be achieved given the sort of digital and social networks that are at our disposal now. And especially in the US context, and this has been going on for a long time in other parts of the world, the adoption of the strategic use of mis and disinformation by political elites. So the behavior of political elites, the behavior of people in the media, maybe opinion leaders, really does matter. And for a long time, we saw a more or less a loose commitment to some sort of shared truth among people with different perspectives. Now, that's not absolute. That's not perfect. I'm not saying that everyone decided always, if we're talking in the American context, to use the same set of shared facts. But I do think that we're seeing the emergence of more of a strategic use of mis and disinformation, which does cause real problems when we think about a democratic style of government in which people's voices are judged to be valuable. And so as we see things like the January 6th insurrection, the use of the big lie frame, we do see that there is a conscious effort to exclude certain types of people. In this context, we're talking specifically about crackdowns on who's allowed to vote, actually. We see these problems manifesting in real problematic ways. Mis and disinformation plays a role in this. It isn't, I would again caution, it's not the only force here or even the predominant causal force. So those are some things that I've been thinking about and talking about lately.
Thank you all so much. Very, very, very interesting. Why don't we see if there's any questions that come out of the discussion chat? You can put them in there until they start kind of piling up. I'll ask a question I was kind of wondering about. Now, maybe a little controversial. What if there is no such thing as conspiracy theory? Rather, what there is are multiple points of information that is defined as truth within distinct public spheres and algorithms that allow for those public spheres to be marketed to certain gazes over and over again. So therefore, one's gaze on one phone who stands next to me is one truth, and then yet the truth is another, is next to me, and so forth. And what we do though is we look over to that other person's phone and say, well, that's a conspiracy theory because my truth in this public sphere says it is, right? So, and that's where I think it may be a little actually drastically different than the past because of the invisible hand in the algorithms that have created so many multiple public spheres based upon clicks instantly, right? I wonder if y'all can speak to that, and maybe also how in the Arabic and African world, those issues are taking up as well, now that we don't have a public sphere for discourse to occur, which democracy needs.
Yeah, so I think this is a really fantastic question and kind of way of framing the discussion. You know, on the one hand, there still do exist plenty of examples, both on and offline, of content that we might still classify as conspiracy in the sense that it is extremely far removed from factual evidence or has been explicitly refuted by factual evidence. But a lot of what we're dealing with in the US context in particular, as you're mentioning, is spin on hot topics, which is targeted at different audiences, as you suggest. And I would argue that this isn't even an issue of the algorithms so much as the structure of these platforms. On Facebook, for example, people seek out communities of friends and like-minded individuals. They join groups that reflect their interests and political beliefs, and all sorts of political actors and foreign actors are looking for people in these communities that they've sorted into and identified themselves as being a part of. So when we look at, for example, Russian disinformation efforts in the US over the past 5 years, we see explicit targeting of people who are in BLM Facebook groups, of people in Texas secessionist Facebook groups, grandmas in Missouri, right? There are people's online choices provide all this identifying information about who they are and what narratives might appeal to them. And then all sorts of actors exploit that. And it's interesting to think about under what circumstances is that legitimate political campaigning that the likes of which has been done for decades, but at the same time opens the way for foreign actors to kind of undermine electoral norms, for example, in the US. So even without the algorithms and the amplification of content, just people's ability to sort in communities on these platforms, I think sets up exactly the dynamics you described.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be answering the question directly, but what really informs conspiracies is the lack of verification, for something that has the ability to be verified. So what I mean is, for example, it's not a conspiracy that God exists, even if we cannot really scientifically verify that, But I think conspiracies emerge because there's, like I said, lack of information, or if somebody probably has kind of given up in terms of trying to find out whether that information can be sought or not. So yes, the element of truth, different truths can be there, but it only exists when we still fail to verify that. Yeah. So the question is, should everything that cannot be verified be considered as, conspiracy, or should it be considered as non-truth or truth? Yeah.
One of the things about conspiracy theories is they're part of our culture. Conspiracy really is linked to many of our sort of folklore type traditions in a given culture. And so, obviously there's a human tendency to embrace the fantastical, to embrace the outlandish. And I think that actually many of our sort of moral stories, our important ways of passing along social information, come from these untrue stories. Conspiracy theorists kind of get that's a negatively valenced concept most times in society. And I think that there's good reason for that. I'm not saying that conspiracies are necessarily good, right? But rather this element of the fantastical is part of human knowledge traditions. When we get down to this notion of truth, we of course have to recognize truth has always been contested. I think there are many sort of epistemic and ontological frames that people apply to truth. I might broadly be classified as sort of a scientific realist, but I think that there's also a laziness to that idea that there exists this one truth out there and that truth is obtainable. At the same time, I think radical constructivism, so that truth is sort of this postmodern beach ball that's sort of in the eye of the beholder. I think there's some credence to that, but I also think, again, that's maybe a lazy way of thinking about the world. There is truth. There also is the reality that human beings can and do make their own truth, and that these things are always in conflict. And that's not sort of throw my hands up at these broader philosophical questions about what is or isn't truth. But I think that, when we stick those lawn signs in our yard that say, I believe in science, I agree with the sentiment there, but I also say that science is messy, it's contested. It takes long periods of time to sort out these issues. I mean, the movement from geocentrism to heliocentrism in the Western world took hundreds of years, right? And so this stuff has always been part of us. I think we ought to embrace that messiness while also saying, what are the things that we as a society hold morally valuable? What are the things that we as a society think about how the world ought to be? And so sometimes we can get lost in this prism of what is and isn't true, and we lose that sort of moral anchoring about what we want society to be, who we should value, so on and so forth. And so I don't know if that really answers a question, or if it just qualifies as rambling. Probably it's just rambling.
I think it brings us to the interesting questions, all of you, to the ethics of conspiracy theory, the ethics.
Maybe before you ask that question, I just wanted to come out as a question for Toby. You raised a point about, let's say, folklore and conspiracy. And I was wondering if we have to be taking those as one and the same thing, or are these separate? So we have, most of the cultures are informed by stories that have been actually accepted, or some which have been taken as true. Would those be considered as conspiracy, or are we looking at something mostly contested? Like, I know conspiracies have a negative connotation, but should we be understanding them in that kind of framework?
Well, Greg, that's a great question. Probably a little above my particular pay grade, but to some extent, it's like, why do the labels matter? Because we spend so much time arguing over, for instance, fake news. What is and isn't fake news? To me, that argument becomes something of a distraction that moves us away, and as Alex talked about earlier, can be politicized and weaponized for certain ideological and political interests. And it moves us away from the sort of moral things that we ought to be considering.
We have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me, Professor Siegel.
No problem. Just to quickly respond to that, and then I'd love to hear more audience questions. I think this broad philosophical question we're never going to come to an answer about, but the kind of political consequence that we care about is, as you mentioned, this politicization of what is truth and the idea that there are now partisan differences in accepted fact. And that, I think, can become a bit dangerous. You talk about those yard signs. I mean, I don't think it actually has much to do with science so much as people publicly displaying their sort of partisan identity in a yard sign by adopting these slogans that, now exist on one side and not the other. And as I mentioned in my kind of initial remarks, we've seen this huge shift. Everybody talks about declining trust in news. Well, that's actually not true among all Americans. That's true among Republicans, and the entire effect is being driven by one partisan group. And so it's useful, I think, for us to kind of take into account these real world political consequences that do come down, I think, from the initial big philosophical questions, but that we're now kind of grappling with more concretely today.
Excellent point. And Professor Nan Goodman has a question I think kind of builds off of that particular point. She notes, I wonder if any or all of you could speak to changes in rhetoric or logic that contemporary conspiracy theories on social media platforms may have manifested in recent years. Is there a certain type of, is there a difference? For example, Professor Hopp, the Ben Franklin example, and I was actually going back to the Lincoln Douglas debates and the things they were saying even at those particular debates that were considered great discourse, right? But is there something distinct about social media platforms that is kind of changing the rhetoric and logic that deals with this today?
Well, I think, one thing that we can say about social media platforms is they purposefully or otherwise really do activate the affective portions of our brain, right? So when you're on social media, what's being stimulated are these really kind of raw emotional responses. In my field, lots of people like to talk about deliberation. So rules-based, formal, in-depth discussion around issues of political concern, with the idea that we're going to arrive at some sort of solution. It might be a compromise, it might be sort of more pure persuasion. And my point has always been like, how can we talk about deliberation on Twitter or Facebook? These platforms aren't designed to facilitate that level of discussion, and no one enters into these spaces with the idea that I am going to come to I'm looking to arrive at some sort of compromise on the abortion issue, for instance. And so I don't know if it's a change in logic, but it is, these platforms, like all media environments, have certain sorts of logics that they prioritize or that they specifically speak to. I think we've really seen a rise in what we call the effective public around and on social media spaces. And those have been some of the big criticisms with, for instance, Facebook's algorithm. What types of a response is it seeking to extract, or emotional state is it seeking to evoke in its individual users? And so that, of course, we can link to the sort of absurd lies, fake news, so on and so forth, which are almost always emotionally charged. The rhetoric there is almost always oriented towards the negative emotional side of the human affective system.
I wonder if we can get Professor Siegel and Professor Gondwe in this, but consider what Gary Frank says of the proliferation of media outlets in the last 40 years on TV and AM radio. Right, because AM radio is an interesting space that is actually global. Because I go to Mexico, and it's also these a lot of these talk shows and these where so that I think everyone wants to kind of focus on the social media platforms, but also note that AM radio, which has been around for decades, lots of things are coming out of AM radio. But anyways, Professor Siegel and Professor Gondwe.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the dynamics we're observing are happening in all corners of a broader media ecosystem, not just online, and are incentivized by new economic models of journalism and media more generally. And so that includes kind of this merging of entertainment and news in order to get more viewership or more listeners or more clicks online. And I think that's the same whether we're talking about radio, TV, or social media. And so the rise of what we see of kind of entertainment content that's designed to sensationalize, to get more eyeballs on content for a longer period of time is intentional, and it's all part of a model of profit for the owners of various stations and media conglomerates. And so I think on the one hand we have the fact that this happens organically because it's a way to make money, and the platforms and outlets are incentivized to keep it going, to continue to profit more. But there's also the explicitly nefarious activity of recognizing that if you want to divide a society and undermine its institutions, playing into these effective traits that Toby is talking about, these the use of emotion to be divisive, I think works very well. And so we've seen that strategy used by both domestic and foreign actors that explicitly want to divide and incite within the US, for example. So it's like an interesting combination of both the sort of economic incentives on the side of media companies, but also the explicit nefarious activity.
Professor Gondwe?
Yeah, I think over the years, what we've seen is just the decline of a single source of information. Initially, even with AM, there was like one channel or one line of information where we could actually attribute a word to somebody else. But today we have a multiplicity of sources creating information, creating the agenda, and that is spread out sometimes and like half-baked. And hence people are left in the position where they have to interpret. And with the interpretation, I think people come up with different forms of responses towards the same kind of message. And that brings in the confusion. So the dailies that we're talking about, the local newspapers, were kind of informed by one single source, but with social media, different media outlets, there's a multiplicity of truths. And hence we fail to actually align with one. Nonetheless, we all are inclined to actually focus on one particular thing, or maybe align with something that corresponds or responds to our needs, our feelings. And we have people within these different platforms that are able to create a platform or create a message that suits our tastes and preferences.
Okay, thank you. Professor Goodman continues, and she has an interesting point. I want to kind of add to her question. Is there a discernible difference now? And in that light, she points back to the muckraking and sensational newspapers of the past and so forth. And Professor Hopp, I kind of am hearing you saying that, well, this is part of democracy. This is messy democracy. This is kind of how it's working. But is there a breaking point, right? Is there a breaking point when the very constitution of public spheres and the multiple public spheres have been, I guess you can say, taken over, if you will, or learned to be manipulated, if you will, or segmentized, put into multiple segments that eventually common understanding of what it means to be part of a collective or a we no longer has any type of glue, right? And therefore, to Professor Goodman's point, is it because of a specific understanding of how public spheres are created now versus the past, perhaps?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say, like, I'm not trying to communicate that I think where we are is a historically sort of normal or healthy place to be as a democracy. I really do think that so many aspects of our particular way of life as it relates to our relationship with our government are really under attack. I think we're really seeing the emergence of a truly minority government in the US. And of course, this is not unprecedented. This happens all over the world and has happened all over the world. I'm very concerned about those things. I mean, democracy is, of course, messy. It's the rationale behind the establishment of a democracy is to solve messy problems in nonviolent ways. When we talk about this notion of the public sphere, I still think that there is a primary public sphere, and there are these what we might call subaltern spheres that circulate around it and do try to manipulate the conversation that goes on in the public sphere. I think we're seeing a fragmentation of the public sphere. I think the public sphere, the discussions that happen in the public sphere are much less efficient than they were in some of the, maybe the pre-internet era. And I think a big part of that is the press and the normative practices of the press, at least in the US, really lend themselves to being manipulated and are being manipulated. I don't know, in terms of a breaking point, we might have crossed it. I really wish I could be more optimistic, but I think it's hard to look at this and say, how do we pull out of this in the US context? How do we pull back? How do we rectify a situation in which one political party is now, as a mainstream function, anti-democratic? And anti-democratic in the sort of loose way that we've used democracy in this country for a very long time. One might argue we've been a multiracial democracy for a very, very short period of time. And even then that could only be tenuously labeled as a democracy. So I don't know. I think it's a cause for great concern.
Professor Siegel, I see that you're typing to respond to Dr. Goodman. Did you want to talk about it?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll happy to jump in here. So I think this is a great question, and I love how Toby opened up with this historical perspective too, because I think it's easy to get focused on, oh, the digital age is totally different, and kind of throw out the window what we know from history. I think the way political communication scholars think about this is around affordances of media technologies. So while of course muckrakers, right, produce these awful headlines, the big difference both for media companies today and for social media platforms is this ability to target specific audiences. And so I actually am thinking about this, I think, a little bit differently than what, say, Greg was describing before about people seeking out content based on taste. Like, yes, that happens. Consumers have choice, but there's also massive efforts on the part of traditional media and social media to target users to kind of join certain communities that suit their preferences. So that means that the types of sensationalist or nasty content that is produced today can be individually or group-wise targeted at these hyper-specific audiences in a way that allows for division, I think, at a whole other scale than you could see in, say, the muckraker era, where there's only so much of a degree to which it could be controlled what eyes would be on what newspaper headlines.
Professor Gondwe.
We're looking, I mean, based on what Alex and Toby has said, we're kind of looking at it in terms of the negative aspects. But I was thinking of it like in terms of positivity. Don't you think that could be some side effects of trying to democratize, the world in some ways, and which is not a bad thing. I'm trying to reference this to the recent occurrences and particularly in Zambia, where I think social media has been used, especially by the youth, to vote out the president that they didn't think was fit for office, and brought in their own. And I think we have a lot of examples of the same kind. It doesn't mean that nothing came out, nothing conspiracy or nothing false came out from that. But the bigger picture is that at least something was achieved. And we have some people that have been able to actually use the proliferated media to send a message that could have not been sent, let's say, years ago.
Did anyone have any other closing remarks? We're at about 12:52, or anything else that you felt you wanted to add to this discussion?
Sure. So I think I really like Greg's point, and I think we can use it to try to end on a more positive note here. That the same forces, the kind of democratization of communication that has led to a proliferation of, fake news and conspiracy theories also still is allowing marginalized communities to mobilize in new ways. And we've seen that with in the US with the BLM movement, with the Me Too movement, but also in authoritarian contexts where these platforms remain some of the only spaces where certain groups have any political voice at all. And so it's easy to kind of note all of the negative aspects that come from social media, but also I think useful to remember the positive, as Greg said. And this is a fast evolving space where good actors will continue to use these platforms in new ways to achieve their goals, and new problems will continue to emerge that we'll contend with as well moving forward.
Professor Hopp.
Well, I agree. I think that we want to think about both problems and solutions, and I think there are solutions out there. When I think about solutions, I do think we need to look beyond just social media. Social media causes certain obvious problems, but I'm part owner of a startup company, and what we do is we analyze all published information every day from around 5,000 institutional publications in the US. And what we found, and so we're specifically monitoring for the way that African-American issues and actors are covered, be it negative or positive. And what we're finding, honestly, is that these news talk, the websites associated with news talk radio, publish the most negative information about African-American folks in our country. And they do so regularly. And it's not fake news. It's over-representation of crime stories in which people's races are mentioned. It's an over-representation of sort of commentary about, certain types of people's mentality towards labor and work, so on and so forth. And so we need to think, social media is a problem, but we need to think, if we're thinking about solutions, more broadly about the media ecosystem and how it reinforces norms around racial equity or inequity, so on and so forth.
Okay. And one of the things that, that we're so lucky to have you at the University of Colorado Boulder is through the education of what it means to live in a world of multiple information platforms, what it means to process that, right? I think as older folks, me being an older folk as well, I was not raised with social media platforms or how to navigate between 6 different apps, 2 different media platforms, TV, and so forth, within 15 minutes, which I see my daughter doing all the time, right? And so the hope is, as we begin to catch up with, we scholars and educators and artists and writers start to catch up, we can start having these conversations as we're having now, as well as with the audience to inform the ways we're going to enact certain, I guess you can say, moral and ethical roads to deal with this changing world, if you will. Are there any other last points from the question answer or the in the chat?
I'll give a last point, maybe, final remark on the question that was asked about how this has impacted, let's say, satire. I think it goes beyond misinformation. It goes up to somewhere like political correctness. I was questioning, like, how do we define comedy now? How do we define satire? To what extent can someone say this is comedy, this is satire? And I think that has become very, very complicated, maybe because of the proliferated information, but that would probably be a question for some other time.
Yeah, no, we can get into the Dave Chappelle, which has been proliferated on, interestingly enough, both sides of the aisle and used in different ways. But no, that's an excellent point. But everyone, thank you so much for participating. Thank you for speaking. and Kat, thank you so much, and the Center for the Humanities for being the host of this, as well as Robert and Mickey and their help. And thank you all out there. I'm sorry I can't see you, but I'd love to see your wonderful faces in a future event. And have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks for hosting, John Michael, and thank you to all the panelists.